Okay. Okay.
Make some notes.
Yeah. So one thing about this chapter, which makes it a little difficult, is that you need to know a good amount about two articles, one by Quine and one by Sellars. And they are articles that you've probably heard a lot about because they're extremely famous. Mm. But it may be a little bit hard to recognize what is really kind of ingenious about Rorty's argument here without having pretty thorough knowledge of those articles. So we might have to spend a little bit of time talking about them as well, just as background. Essentially, though, I'll give a very, very general overview, and then I'd like to hear from you what you took from it. But essentially, this is Rorty. So first of all, this is the fourth chapter, but it's kind of the central argument in the whole book. And it starts off as a way of problematizing inconsistencies in the history of philosophy with respect to the question of certainty, whether knowledge can ever have a certain foundation.
Yep.
And so what Rorty is going to want to do is reject that picture and bring in a picture that is, it's usually referred to as anti-foundationalist, right? It is to say that we don't need certainty to have knowledge, right? And instead of thinking about knowledge in terms, or really even thinking about knowledge as a particularly fruitful branch of philosophy, epistemology, to think more about knowledge in terms of how we use it when we interact with other people in the world.
Yep.
Right. And so this aspect of, to use the slogan from Wittgenstein, meaning is use, to move away from this idea of knowledge in terms of truth or certainty or something that somehow connects us to God or some non-human eternal status of the universe or something like that. It's a rejection of all that, and an argument for the idea that we can have a very thorough account of knowledge simply by treating it as something that a particular organism uses as an adaptation.
Yeah.
And that it has a fairly complicated structure because it's not just a single organism interacting causally with its environment. It also requires that groups of organisms work together in a pro-social way and whatever. But none of that is enough to show that we need an account of certainty to ground knowledge. We can simply see knowledge, claims about knowledge as a certain sort of activity. And one really important thing is to recognize that what previously had been thought of as a distinction, say the truth and claims about the truth, so that there is a truth whether or not we're making claims about it, to move from that picture to a picture that says something more like, well, whether or not there is a truth independent of our claims, we only come to some awareness of it through the claims.
Yeah.
Right? It's only through talking about it, right. Coping with uh, this thing that we're calling truth in a social way, a socially mediated way, a way that involves rules about how conversations work and all this kind of stuff. That's how we can have a grasp on the true. And so we don't really need this idea of a distinction between the world as it actually is, the mind independent truth, and our minds and our logic and our language as a mirror of that that gets closer to the non-human world. We first of all, we never actually have any contact with that. What we have is contact with some picture that we maybe use as part of our game of justifying beliefs and this kind of thing. But we don't really need a picture of some truth that stands alone from the way we use concepts like truth in our social activity, having conversations, right?
Reminding me of keeping score.
Well, yeah, right. So in fact, Brandom was a student of Rorty. Yeah, yeah. Well, Rorty was his dissertation advisor. Um, Although I think Brandom says that he feels he's closer to Wilfrid Sellars than Richard Rorty because Rorty is often taken to be fairly extreme in that he sets up a perspective, say anti-foundationalism, and then just sort of follows it to its logical consequences and makes fairly radical claims about truth being nothing more than a sort of social approval or this sort of thing. Uh, and generally makes lots of people in philosophy angry because essentially what he comes to argue for is the idea that philosophy um, doesn't do what it thinks it does. In other words, it doesn't accurately reflect some metaphysical status of some human independent reality. It's just a way of telling a story in the way that literature is and so on. And so, um, that makes a lot of philosophers angry because the one thing that philosophy is supposed to do better than any other science or discipline or whatever is examine the foundations of the way that we think or the foundations of the way certain sciences operate. What are the foundational assumptions, right? And what Rorty wants to do is say we don't have to worry about foundations. We have to worry about what we're doing when we talk about foundations, what we're doing when we're talking about truth.
Yeah. So historically, was this the reason why philosophers try to like find some sort of a foundation or something? Because like we wanted philosophy to progress just like scientific progress, and there was some sort of like, oh, are we as good as the scientists, or
Well, I think that came a little bit later, right? Because, with Aristotle, philosophy and in particular metaphysics is the queen of sciences. It's the first science, right? It's the science of all sciences. Like, if you want to understand, physics, you first have to understand how the assumptions of physics are justified, right? And so, you know, um, and I'd say with Descartes, you also have a different sort of foundationalism that isn't, first of all, motivated by the sense that science is developing in a way that philosophy isn't, because science had just gotten started in the 17th century, right? I think that what you're describing is something that is descriptive of how 20th century and maybe 21st century people think about the distinction between empirical science and philosophy. I think that probably the sense is that you need certainty to have knowledge at all, right? That would be the main motivation for finding accounts of certainty, because it doesn't take long before um, yeah, if you can't identify some bedrock uh, sort of certainty understood in the following sense, perhaps like a proposition that can justify other propositions, but that does not itself need to be justified. If you don't have that, then it doesn't take long for the whole structure of knowledge to collapse.
Yeah.
Because all you have to do is keep asking why, or how do you know that, or whatever, and you'll keep going back into some sort of regressive, either an infinite regress of constantly asking for justification,
Yeah.
or you might have a circular justification, right? That is to say, A justifies B, which justifies C, which justifies A, which justifies, right? So that would be sort of an infinite regress in a different sort of sense, one where the terms are repeated, right? Or you have to have some kind of claim, some kind of way of getting knowledge, of justifying knowledge, that is to say, some foundation for knowledge that doesn't itself need to be justified.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it's an infinite regress or it's circular, and those are both bad for knowledge.
Yeah.
Right. So that is a form of Agrippa's trilemma. right? It's this idea. Now, that's with respect to justification.
Yeah.
Agrippa's trilemma works with any claim or I suppose mental operation that has a sort of chain of inheritance. What I mean by that is like something like causality is also subject to the same problem, right? Like A causes B, which causes C, but what caused A?
Right.
So you could go back in an infinite regressive causality, or it could be circular, or you have to have a first cause.
Yeah.
Right. But any chain of inheritance could be justification. It could so in the case of Descartes, the main problem is with respect to representation. So it could be like, how do we have certain knowledge of the world? Well, there is a class of mental operations that uh, are capable of representing the world, but are not themselves representations. In other words, like you could look at this in terms of perception. This is one thing that's interesting about Descartes, first of all, which is that unlike uh, Plato, Platonic certainty, which is all about um, the world of appearance and the world of intelligibility, right? That which we can understand versus that which we perceive. And, perception is supposed to be the false world and the intelligible world is supposed to be the true world. With Descartes, the problem is not about perception and thought. The problem is between fallibility and infallibility, which is to say, which mental operations can you be wrong about? And which, if any, mental operations can you not possibly be wrong about, right? And the reason that that's significant is that for Descartes, both perception and intelligibility, understanding, are mental operations. They're distinct from the physical. But then you still get a similar sort of distinction to Plato between true and false, but now it's between those mental acts that could possibly be wrong and those which can't possibly be wrong. And so you see with representation, the way this plays a role is that when we represent the world to ourselves, say in perception and thought or whatever, it's possible that that representation isn't actually grasping onto reality. So in other words, we could be wrong about that. But according to Descartes, what you can't be wrong about is the way it seems.
Yeah.
Right? You can be wrong that it is the way it seems.
Right.
But if I say, oh, it seems to me like that's a bottle there, and then if I were to ask you, oh, does it really seem like that, or does it just seem to seem? You say, no, seeming to seem is just the same thing as it seeming. In other words, there is no further regress that comes out of that representation. There is a way of describing representations themselves, the act of representing, as itself foundational. Right? Which is to say, can you be wrong about the fact that you're representing something to yourself? No, because if it seems that way, it can't seem to seem, it only seems that way. Whereas it might seem that it's a bottle, but maybe it's not really a bottle, but the seeming doesn't have that kind of regress. Right? So that's supposed to be the way that Descartes stops the regress, right?
So Descartes, I think, therefore I am, right? So so the I think, which is like, let's say, the immediate self-consciousness or whatever, that foundation for him, because you can't be wrong about.
Yeah. So one thing that's significant there, right, is simply though that for Descartes, unlike Plato, perception and thinking aren't different kinds, right? So for Plato, perception is a different kind of awareness than intelligibility, understanding, right? Which is to say that if you know the definition of the perfect triangle, that gives you a sort of certainty, right? It gives you a formal definitional kind of certainty that you might see something that you think is a triangle, but then if you look closer, even if it's like a triangle on a page, the more you look at it, the more you realize that actually it's not a perfect triangle. It starts to break down. It's like, oh, well, so how did you know that it's an imperfect triangle? Well, you must have a model of the perfect triangle, but you never see that model. You can only understand it, right? And so for Plato, the distinction is between perception, which is false, and understanding or intelligibility, which is the only way to get to truth, certainty, right? Is through, maybe you start by looking at things around you or whatever, but in order to classify them in an adequate and true way, you need some sort of conceptual understanding, some intelligibility, right? But for Descartes, the main difference is that he's not really asking about perception versus intelligibility. He's asking about what can you be mistaken about? Yeah. And is there anything that you can't be mistaken about? And the thing that's interesting about that is that one thing you can't be mistaken about is the way things seem in perception to you, right? Yeah. So the thing about thinking is it's also true that if you seem to be thinking to yourself, then you are thinking. You can't seem to think. But there, what's interesting is that what is the thing that defines the incorrigibility in Descartes? It's not even so much the understanding versus sensory perception; it's the seeming, right? The seeming is the thing you can't be wrong about. Yeah. Which is to say, the representation. And the representation admits of different forms. It admits of perceptual representation. It admits of intelligible representation. But what is foundational is representation. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Yeah. So, that's the way that he solves that. And that is significant for, 20th century philosophy, in particular, analytic philosophy, because that is also the picture that they take with respect to certainty. Right? That is to say that there is at least one way of acquiring knowledge through sensation or through perception, right? That gives you, well, actually, they're the same too, really. Either through these sorts of perceptual encounters where you can't be wrong about how it looks to you, yeah, or through analytic propositions or analytic statements, whatever, that is to say, true by definition. Both of them allow for certainty. Yeah. Right? In the Cartesian picture, and also in the picture of analytic philosophy. Right? But in both cases, what is significant is that thought on its own isn't enough for certainty in the way it is for Plato. It's thought as representation, because it's the representation that gives the foundationalism.
It's same for Kant too, right?
Yeah, I mean, Kant is also in that tradition, although Kant is kind of interesting in a few ways. He's definitely a foundationalist, but it turns out that most of the people, including I assume Rorty, although I'm not totally sure, but I'm fairly certain that most of the people in the analytic tradition that criticize Kant as a foundationalist never read the Third Critique. Ah. Because the Third Critique is a really interesting moment where Kant deals with the problems of foundationalism and the problems of conceptuality and perception, and the problem of trying to link up perception and concepts in a unified way. Yeah. Right. So he's kind of interesting in that regard. If you only read the first critique, he comes across as basically Cartesian. Although one thing that he introduces that Descartes doesn't introduce, if you look here in the outline, where I say philosophy needs two hierarchical distinctions. There's the foundational versus the derivative. Yeah. So foundational means what you can't be wrong about. Derivative means what you can possibly be wrong about. Yeah. But then among the foundational representations, you need a distinction between sense givenness and meaning, the synthetic and the analytic. Because for Descartes, those are both just part of the mental, the mind substance, right? It's just what is distinct in Descartes is representation, but he kind of throws sensation and understanding together. And Kant picks those apart into a necessary distinction between sensation meaning, or the synthetic and the analytic, or you could even think of it in terms of, say, intuition and understanding,
Yeah.
right? Which is to say, Kant introduces the distinction. One way of looking at it is just that without that distinction, empirical science has a problem, which is that it would be, in principle, possible to never do any kind of experimentation or any kind of observation if you didn't have that distinction. If you could get to, say, analytic truth through sensation,
Yeah.
for instance, then you wouldn't have to do physics, you just think about it. However, without that, if you could, through just using analysis, that is to say, intelligibility, thinking, you could then say things about observation, then the problem is that it's not really clear that you would have knowledge about the world.
Yes.
You'd have knowledge of your mind, but what Kant wants is knowledge that is necessary, but also about the world.
Necessary and contingent.
Well, it's synthetic a priori. That's the thing. So like analytic knowledge should be available a priori. You don't have to look at the world.
Yeah.
But if it's synthetic, then it's about the world.
Yeah.
So somehow you have to be able to know something about the world a priori, which means that you have to have a distinction between sensation and analysis. Somehow you have to be able to have them be distinct, but then come together in certain propositions that can genuinely be about the world, but not just about your mind, but also don't require that you observe the world, right? And so that's this synthetic a priori, where it's like, that's needed for knowledge of universal laws of nature. It's needed for, ethics, to say that, look, we can have a completely systematic and coherent ethical theory, but we don't want it to just be this virtual mental exercise. We want it to be about reality, right?
Yeah.
So that is to say that for metaphysics to be possible, you need a distinction, but then you also need that distinction to be able to be overcome, right? That is to say that one way of looking at it is, without a distinction, then you would never know if what you have to say has only to do with your mind versus the world.
Yeah.
But without a unity or some kind of way of combining them, you would never be able to say something about the world that were necessarily true. Right. So that's the way that Kant develops Descartes' distinction, but it's still foundational, right? It's still foundational. There are foundational types of awareness representations that we have access to.
I mean, even
At least this is Rorty's analysis of it. I think it's basically right.
yeah, with like 12 categories and stuff, it seems like pretty foundational in the sense that like kind of strictly laid out and
Yeah, right. So yeah, but the thing is, with only the 12 categories, but without intuition, you still would not know if what you're saying is actually about the world, about reality.
Yeah.
It would just be pure idealism.
Yeah.
Right. And what Kant is actually leveling a critique against rational idealism, right? Because what he wants to say is that our knowledge is actually kind of piecemeal. They're different, imperfect sorts of knowledge that we can have. We can have knowledge through the senses. I should say it this way. The things of which we can have objective knowledge have to be available to the senses. The things of which we can have analytic a priori knowledge don't have to be available to the senses. But the thing is that things like science, physics, universal laws of nature, so nature understood as all the stuff that we're observing, that nonetheless seems to operate within a set of universal laws, so that there's a sort of regularity or necessity to nature. suggests that what we're doing is, at least with respect to how nature must appear to us, uncovering something that is a priori necessary, but also synthetic and contingent about the world, right? That is to say, the world itself is synthetic. It's not, we're not pure idealists. We're really talking about reality,
Yeah.
not just a mental model of reality.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, in talking about reality, we're able to uncover certain metaphysical necessities.
Right.
Universal laws and ethics are the main ones.
Yeah. And so what Kant did was say that, like, well, these laws are shaped due to our cognitive structure, right? Like,
Essentially, what Kant is saying with respect to science is saying that when we do science, there are two things that we're not doing. One, we're not just doing some kind of coherent mental exercise that has the structure of necessity, but who knows if it's real, as opposed to just ideal in our heads or whatever. But he's also, in talking about the world, not saying that it's all just contingent and all only available through sensation. He's saying that there's a combination of two different ways of getting at the world. And it's in that combination that you can then, if he's right, say that reality itself, not just the ideal picture of reality, but reality itself is, at least for us, amenable to, or maybe constitutively demonstrates this kind of necessity, this kind of universality or whatever, right? So that's all it is. It's in a sense, he's famous for being a compatibilist between empiricism and rationalism, but in being a compatibilist, he's also criticizing both of the other traditions, because what he's saying is that you can't actually get to adequate scientific or moral knowledge through only one path. You need two paths that you bring together in synthetic a priori judgments. So, for Rorty's purposes, that doesn't matter that much. The main thing, it matters a little bit to get a really kind of granular sense for what he's arguing with respect to Quine and Sellars in this article. But the main thing is to see the history of philosophy as a series of attempts to develop some kind of foundation for knowledge.
Yeah.
Because, and the idea being that if you don't have a foundation, then you don't have knowledge. Because there's this idea that knowledge is somehow separate from activity. Right? Finding the knowledge or saying something about the knowledge, or saying something about knowledge or the truth or whatever, I think that's traditionally sort of thought of as activity. I mean, Socrates and Plato talk about dialectic understood as a sort of process or whatever, but there's a sense that truth has this metaphysical status that is independent of the various sorts of activities that we might perform that make us aware of the truth or whatever. What Rorty is basically just arguing, the pragmatic move is to make truth not something that stands outside of the activity of talking about the truth.
Yeah.
Which is not to say that it's completely relativistic.
Yeah.
Although he often gets charged with being a relativist. There are ways to overcome that. I mean, you can always look at contingent facts of the matter that, like, human beings consider truth talk to be very important.
Yeah.
For this sort of thing. And so that gives you already a sort of social foundation.
Right.
We're just sort of hardwired to have good feelings about the truth and bad feelings about things that aren't true, but that is often taken to be not a strong enough foundation, right, for a lot of philosophers, because then it's essentially nothing more than either a biological or anthropological theory. It's not a philosophical theory.
Yeah.
Right. And so he often is talking here about philosophy needing to justify its research projects, justifying its place in the university, essentially, right? Because it's like, if it's too hard and mathematical, then it doesn't do anything that the sciences don't do. If
Yeah.
it's too soft, then it's just second-rate art or humanities. And so
Yeah.
it has to find some place for itself. And that's, according to him, why it constantly brings forward these hierarchical distinctions, these foundational distinctions, right? So that philosophy is supposed to be about foundations, and that's what its unique place is, because no other discipline is supposed to care as much about the foundations. They just take them for granted because they work for their research.
Yeah.
And then what he is basically arguing, which is something that Quine argued before, is that actually philosophy does the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Philosophy isn't really foundational. It's more general or abstract than physics or empirical science, but it's not foundational. Mostly the argument he gives against foundationalism is that uh, the defenses for it don't really work. And so, or at least the defenses that are traditionally used or that have been used so far don't really work. And so there's a better story you can tell.
Yeah.
So that is explicitly the way that Quine argues against foundationalism with respect to analytic statements.
Yeah.
It's interesting that it's not really a knockdown argument, right? It's not really that. I think Rorty just adopts Quine's argument with respect to that analytic statements. But the argument is basically like this. It's not that you show that analytic statements are logically impossible, or that it's, even if they're not logically impossible, that it's logically impossible to give a defense. That's not what he does. What he does is show, look, the only defenses, the only arguments that anybody's ever given don't work. And I can't think of any more arguments. So let's just change the subject. Let's just have a new story. Instead of telling a story that so far hasn't worked, foundationalism, let's tell another story that maybe gives us, keeps the things that we want from foundationalism, but gives us other things that bring philosophy closer in line with empirical science.
Yeah.
To see philosophy as a kind of activity, a kind of social, mode of social interaction or this kind of thing, which means that if you follow that line of thinking, philosophy doesn't really have any reason to exist as a separate discipline.
Right, because then it comes close to being science.
Yeah, essentially, right. It's which is not to say that philosophy departments would have to disappear.
Yeah.
It's more a matter of, kind of, it's like an existential kind of question, right?
Yeah.
Like, does philosophy have a sort of authority that the sciences don't have? Or is philosophy just a collection of tools that you can use in other sciences or whatever, but it's not a foundation. It's just there are certain tools that are actually really just organized around maintaining or perhaps manipulating the structure of social interaction, conversation, giving reasons, taking reasons, this kind of thing, right? What philosophers do is look at the rules of the game really closely.
Yeah.
But that's not a foundation,
no.
Right? That's just a particularly specific approach to anthropology, right? Yeah. So that's kind of the picture in the background here. Yeah. So that's probably a good kind of introduction. We should probably talk a little bit about Quine and Sellars. I expanded the Sellars stuff quite a lot. None of the Quine or Sellars stuff is explicitly there in the Rorty chapter. That's why I put it in.
Right.
So maybe you can also, rather than look at my outline now, although it might actually be most efficient to just kind of like go through the outline. But it would be kind of nice to hear from you things you were confused about, things that were not making sense, or maybe if there were things that suggested other directions
So
to
he's
go in.
Rorty's trying to defend Quine and Sellars, right?
Well, okay, so here is one thing that is kind of like a one reason that this book and this chapter in the book is famous is that he's doing two things that at the time would have been taken to be pretty surprising.
Yeah.
One claim he's making is that analytic philosophy is actually just a continuation of Kant,
Mm-hmm.
which, if you were to ask Russell, he would completely have denied. He thought that he was doing something. The main reason being that, Russell was part of this reaction against Hegelianism and absolute idealism. And they saw Kant as essentially just being in that same camp, maybe a little bit less absolutist than Hegel. But the problem was that they could not find a way to keep Hegel out but let Kant in. Because the thing is that there was a strong sense that there is, whether or not they read Kant correctly is another question. I mean, I think that Kant is often, even in his own lifetime, was accused of being like an absolute idealist, like a strong idealist, like a Berkeleyan, like George Berkeley style idealist, where it's like all we have are our own thoughts or our own modes of perception or whatever. We have no way of talking about reality. As I just tried to point out with the synthetic a priori, it's supposed to really be about reality,
Yeah.
but it's combining some aspects of, uh, you know, um, uh, intelligibility as it is levied towards grasping reality. But there is a strong anti-idealist element in Kant, but he was typically in his own lifetime and afterwards taken to be a defender of idealism. And so in the 19th century, Hegelianism started to dominate English-speaking philosophy programs, both in North America and England and so on. People like F.H. Bradley and Josiah Royce. Josiah Royce was the American teacher of people like, I think he was the teacher of Dewey and some other early 20th century American philosophers. Bradley was also quite influential in England, but among other things, idealism often ends up seeming fairly bloated in terms of its ontology. The things that it brings in is, it's not particularly scientific in the modern empirical sense, right? And so, for various reasons, it became fairly unpopular in the early 20th century. And the problem was that Kant was taken to be like the person who sort of began the tradition of absolute idealism. And so for the first half of the 20th century, people ignored Kant pretty dramatically. What Rorty is claiming is that analytic philosophy is actually just Kantianism. So that would have been a big thing. We're like, what are you talking about? They were rejecting Kant. Yeah. Okay. The other thing that is kind of a big surprise in this article is the way he talks about Quine and Sellars as both being insufficiently pragmatic. Quine actually considered himself at least partially a pragmatist. I think Sellars resisted considering himself a pragmatist. Sellars was explicit about being, in some sense, a Kantian, although not like thoroughly Kantian. But the thing that Rorty is arguing here is that both Quine and Sellars present themselves as being anti-foundationalist, but only with respect to one of the two sources of foundationalism. In the case of Quine, meaning or intelligibility or analytic truths are things that Quine wants to reject. But he keeps sensation as a possible source of certainty. And Sellars is the opposite. He takes sensation to be non-foundational, but wants to keep meaning, so that you have, like the slogan of theory-laden
Yeah.
perception, right? That observation is always theory-laden, which is to say that there's something contingent about perception. You don't, and this is Sellars, you don't have direct access to the given. The given is completely neutral sensation that can be used to justify beliefs.
Yeah.
Right? Like, for instance, um, if I say it's true that there is a jam jar with coffee in it on my desk, how can I justify that to you?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah.
So looking at it is supposed to be a way of justifying the belief that there's a jam jar with coffee in it on my desk. What Sellars argues, one thing he's famous for arguing in empiricism and philosophy of mind, is that actually you never get to that kind of sensation. That is to say, sensation is never, like, when I see that as evidence for or justification for the belief there's a jam jar with coffee on my desk, it's not because I have some completely neutral sense datum that is justifying that belief, because what I'm seeing is a conceptualized observation, which is to say, just because it's conceptualized, it's socially mediated on one level, but it's also contingent in the sense that it's only with respect to these concepts. It's not because there's some incorrigible fact of the matter that's available to me as something that justifies my belief. It's not to say that every sensation that I have is conceptualized, because lots of stuff comes at me all the time and I don't conceptualize it all. It's just whenever I take a sensation as a justification for a belief, that sensation isn't neutral, it's conceptualized.
Right.
So that's what Sellars is arguing, which means that he is trying to get rid of foundationalism from the perspective of sensation, but keeps meaning. Whereas Quine wants to get rid of meaning, analyticity, but he keeps sensation.
Yeah, you have that example of falling, which I liked. Was
Yeah.
it the last? It's in this one as well, right?
I think it's probably under Sellars.
Yeah. Um, right. About um, background and context and falling in and of itself.
Yeah.
It's no meaning.
Right.
Unless it's like you're falling where or on what or right. And I think you mentioned something about pain also.
Yeah. Well, let me just kind of wrap up what Rorty's saying about Quine and Sellars with respect to his critique of foundationalism. What he's saying is that they still remain in the world of analytic philosophy because they don't totally want to get rid of foundationalism.
Yeah.
Quine wants to keep sensation as a source of foundationalism or as a source of certainty. Sellars wants to keep meaning. And so then what Rorty says is they both kind of forgot about pragmatism. One thing he says earlier on, which I have up here in the history of a problem, the very first section, is that it's interesting because you have the empirical tradition which wants to ground certainty in sense perception, and you have the rational tradition which wants to ground certainty in self-evident ideas. And then it's interesting, like in the late 19th century, you have these pragmatists, William James, John Dewey, and others, I suppose those are the most famous ones, that actually are real anti-foundationalists. Quine, or not Quine, Dewey talks about, what does he talk about? I don't remember if he uses the term naturalization or not. I know Quine does, but what Dewey does want to do is make philosophy compatible with evolution. He talks a lot about the theory of evolution and organisms and interests and all these kinds of things. And what Rorty says is there was that brief period right around the end of the 19th to the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century. But for whatever reason, it was short-lived because analytic philosophy came around and reasserted foundationalism,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably with part of the problem with pragmatism, well, one, there's the sense that people don't like relativism or anything that even remotely appears to be relativistic.
Right.
There's also the problem, even though Charles Saunders Peirce is often taken to be one of the people that began the pragmatist project, and he actually invented a form of symbolic logic before Frege and whatnot. There's something about the mathematical approach of Frege and Russell that, for whatever reason, probably because it asserts that certainty is possible in one form or another, seems more prestigious.
Yeah.
Seems like it's real and not, you know. So for whatever reason, he doesn't really give an account of why analytic philosophy was able to reassert foundationalism in the early 20th century, but that's the picture he gives. And so that's why Dewey is forgotten by Quine and Sellars, or if not totally forgotten, at least isn't really taken to be a viable research project because analytic philosophy was still the dominant form.
Yeah.
And so, but what Rorty wants to do is completely return to pragmatism,
Right.
completely return to like a naturalistic or behavior oriented approach to it's really a story he's telling about everything that is typically included in philosophy.
Yeah.
Right. Which again is just to say, if it's about behavior, then it's to say that knowing is just another form of activity. Right.
Yeah.
Anything that is important to philosophy, truth, knowledge, whatever,
yeah.
philosophy in, say, the Platonic sense, is really just a confused way of describing what organisms are doing.
Yeah.
That's the claim.
Mm. Um, I think we very briefly spoke about the Marian room experiment.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, a lot of what we're talking about today reminds me of that thought experiment about Mary in the black and white room and waiting for her.
Yeah.
Does Mary gain any new knowledge when she goes out to the real world?
Mm-hmm.
Color.
Mm-hmm.
There's some argument about like, well, knowledge via experience is different from knowledge via.
Well, right. I mean, even Russell has knowledge by acquaintance.
Yeah.
I think it'd be useful for us to spend some time on the Sellars stuff that I put in here because that's really going to pick out some pretty important distinctions about what we mean by knowledge, what we mean by justification, and what the sort of social or active role is in these things that are taken to be somehow, mind independent or something, right? Like that, but without going through it in detail, it is fairly hard to get a really strong sense for how powerful the argument is against foundationalism. So we could look at the Quine first. I don't know that there's that much that I need to say about Quine. You haven't read that article, have you? Or are you familiar with it? Two Dogmas of Empiricism. I mean, I have a really brief summary of it, which you could just go through quickly. So essentially, the way the article goes is that the reason it's called Two Dogmas and not on the impossibility of, say, analytic certainty or something. It's because what he wants to say is there are these things, these assumptions people have in analytic philosophy that they've never given a good defense for.
Yeah.
Right. That's all he's saying.
Yeah.
It's not that they're false.
Yeah.
Sort of like if you dogmatically assert that God exists, and for me to call it a dogma in the sense of criticizing it, it's not that I'm saying that it's impossible that God exists. It's that I'm saying you haven't given me any reason to believe that God exists.
Yeah.
Right. So that's an important aspect to what Quine is doing, which is to say, look, you've got these problems with analytic philosophy. The first problem is with the word analytic. What does that mean? What is analyticity? Analyticity is supposed to be a term that is related to certainty,
Mm.
right? The word that gets used a lot here is apodictic. Are you familiar with that term?
That's like the like truth that's like certain. Right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So right. So it's supposed to be another way of getting at this is it's one way of getting to the a foundation because something that is analytically true doesn't need to be justified. It's self-justifying.
Yeah.
Right? That's the idea, right? It's supposed to be a foundation. And even there, it's already kind of obvious what direction Quine is going to take in his critique of analyticity. If analyticity, which essentially means truth by virtue of definition, can worry about this later. Yeah. I'm sure it'll stop by the time I silence it. There it is. All right, well, I'll worry about that later. If analyticity means truth by definition, um, then you've got sort of a problem because in saying analyticity means truth by definition, what I'm saying is the definition of analyticity is truth by definition. You see the problem?
It's circular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? Which is to say, you can't get to what it is, what it means, without already invoking it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's a problem. It isn't actually, if you look here, look at the, it isn't actually a regress stopper, it's number 2.
Yeah.
It's circular. That is to say that it's defining itself in terms of itself.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one problem. That's the problem of synonymy. Well, okay, maybe it means something else. Maybe when we're talking about meaning, we're talking about the capacity on an extensional level for one term to be replaced by another term and to be true in all sentences, regardless of which term we use, right? Which is to say, on an extensional level, um, if I say that Bruce Wayne is right-handed, I can just swap that out with Batman is right-handed, and it's true because it's the same thing that I'm talking about, right? But the problem is that it doesn't. First of all, what we want to know is not about reference extension, the picking out of an extension. What we want to know is what is this meaning thing doing? And the other problem is that there are certain meanings that, he uses the example of a creature with a heart and a creature with a kidney, which, unlike the Batman Bruce Wayne example, doesn't necessarily pick out the same entity because they're not names, they're descriptions. But it just so happens that every animal that has a heart also has kidneys, but it's not included in the definition. So these are different intentions, they're different meanings, but they pick out the same thing. And so the problem is that, what is the problem here? The problem is that, the problem is just that it doesn't differentiate between intention and extension. And what we want to know, what we want to have is some idea of what intention or meaning or analyticity is, not reference. And so this other definition or this other way of thinking about what analyticity is, the capacity to switch out terms, isn't enough because it doesn't differentiate between intention and extension. And we want to know what intention is, not reference.
Yeah.
And so then it's just sort of a chain from there. Since no defensive analyticity is available, no defensive context-independent meaning is available, which is to say that every meaning that you have is going to, in some way, be relative to the context that it arises in. There's never going to be a meaning that means itself or is somehow, necessary or whatever, because it's always going to be relative to the context that it can mean in. And then from there, in number 4, I say this suggests, it doesn't prove, but it does suggest that meaning can't be separated from background context or background assumptions. And if that's the case, then it starts this chain where, well, if no meanings can be separated from their background assumptions, then the meanings of sentences about observation can't be. And if those sentences about observations can't be separated from their background, they can't be reduced to unique observation events. In other words, what he's trying to do is show that because meaning is always context dependent, there's no way to reduce it to some completely context-free observation, right? That is to say that a context-free observation would be something that you could arrive at through a context-free observation sentence. But since the meaning of the sentence is always going to be somehow relative to the rest of your beliefs or the rest of your meanings or whatever, there's no way to get it to reduce to a completely context-free observation event. In other words, like an absolute observation. And so then we need a new theory of knowledge. And so then what he introduces is instead of this idea of there being certain kinds of sentences, analytic sentences, or certain kinds of events, observation events that can stand alone and therefore provide certainty, we come to meaning, the meaning of any sentence, for instance, is always dependent on the meanings of the rest of possible sentences, the rest of your beliefs. And so there's no way to get to the sort of atomic certainty that is promised by the analytic tradition, because all meanings are always context dependent, and to get to an observation event, you would have to, for that to be somehow meaningful or somehow significant, it has to be translated into an observation sentence. But since those observation sentences have no independent meaning, they only have meaning with respect to the rest of your beliefs, there's no way to drill down to some like absolute pinpoint certainty. One way of thinking about that is, so there's the Quine-Duhem thesis, which is the idea that you can never falsify a theory because it's always possible that some background assumption is what is responsible for a falsification and not the hypothesis. So a hypothesis never has meaning on its own. It only has meaning with respect to all the rest of the beliefs that you have, including, you can always connect it to beliefs such as we are standing on or near the surface of the Earth, or, Saturn has however many moons or whatever. I mean, there's always some way to connect all of your beliefs up in this network, this web of beliefs. And because of that, it's never possible to get to a hypothesis sentence that is completely independent of all the background assumptions. But you would need that to be certain that you're falsifying the theory. You would need to be able to strip out all the background assumptions that you're not stating. What Quine is basically arguing is that you can never get to that point because the sentence, I am studying the triple point of water or the freezing point of water, that only has meaning with respect to everything else. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, meaning comes as a huge network of relationships, sort of fully formed, so to speak. Now, that's not to say that you can't change beliefs. It's just that any belief you change will change, depending on how significant the belief is, might change only local beliefs, while maybe outer beliefs would stay the same or could possibly stay the same. But the problem is that there's nothing specific about any of these beliefs that makes them a separate kind, certain analytic beliefs, right? What he's saying is that all beliefs, because they're part of this web of belief, even analytic beliefs are part of that same web, which is to say, it's not that they're certain, they could be changed. It's just that they would change a lot of the rest of the web, but that doesn't show that they're different kinds of beliefs. It just shows that the consequences would be more severe if you decided to no longer believe that 1 equals 1. But it's not because 1 = 1 is a special kind of belief. It's just that you have practical interests that prevent you from wanting to do that.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the pragmatist move there, right? It's this idea that beliefs, because they don't stand alone, um, there can be no beliefs that are of a specific type that can be context independent and therefore certain, which means that if no beliefs can be context independent and certain, there's nothing preventing you from saying that they're false, except for the fact that you don't want to.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or it's not just that you don't want to, but that, it would have all sorts of consequences.
Right.
But analyticity is supposed to be something that is, like epistemologically different from, say, synthetic statements.
Right.
But what he's arguing is actually it's not. It's just people are more reluctant to give up to the things that they're calling analytic, but they're not different in kind.
Yeah. I mean, it's happened with mathematical theorems all over the place. Like they start with, let's say, like let X be whatever.
Yeah. Well, that's an axiom,
Yeah.
right? Axioms aren't necessarily taken. I mean, they are definitional. They're not often, or they're not always taken to be certain in the sense of things like the law of identity, right? The law of identity is analytic in the sense that a term is self-evidently defines itself, right? It's like 1 = 1, and that's just sort of taken to be obviously true and indisputable because really by virtue of the meaning of the term, right? One means one, right? But even that could be rejected.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, there would be consequences, like it probably make it impossible to have coherent language.
Yeah.
But I mean, you could still do it, which means that it's not the sort of thing that is somehow epistemologically different, right? It's just that there are more severe consequences, and that's it. Okay, so the Sellars stuff. So that shows you a little bit about why Quine, or the pragmatic move, but it's a pragmatic move around getting rid of meanings, understood as a source of certainty. But then you get Sellars here, and this one is fairly in the weeds, and so we probably won't have enough time to get through the rest of Rorty's chapter if we look at Sellars, but I think that's fine. I think it's probably good to get a strong sense of what Sellars is doing, and then next time look at the rest of.
On Thursday? Or you have that improv thing?
I do have the improv thing. I think I could do something in the afternoon on
Like
Thursday.
12 for like an hour, 12:30 to 1:30 or something? Or is that limited?
That's when I do my thing. It could be over Zoom at a slightly later time.
Yeah.
Do you think we have time to get through Sellars today, or do you have to run off?
I have physiotherapy 2:30, but I can stay here.
Okay, let's go until 2. I think we can hopefully get through this. Okay, so I didn't summarize the whole. Actually, the summary of the Quine is almost pretty much the entire article. It's a fairly short article. It's only about 20 pages.
Yeah.
The Sellars is like 75 pages or something, and there's a lot to it. And so I didn't summarize the whole article there.
That's the emphasis in law school.
Yeah. Yeah. What I tried to do is give a sense of the most important distinction that he makes, of which his story about the myth of the given is just an example. I take this from Robert Branham has a bunch of lectures about Sellars, which are pretty fascinating and really clear, among other things, and really deep in a way that I hadn't heard people talk about Sellars before. Because really what Branham is doing is pinpointing the main distinction that everything else comes from. Everything else kind of flows from. Whereas most people are simply interested in the myth of the given, and then this idea of theory-laden perception or whatever, and that's it. And what Branham does in some of his lectures is show how that story is actually just an example
Mm.
of this basic distinction. So the basic distinction is what he calls the ing-ed distinction.
Uh-huh.
So the ing-ed distinction is this, ing versus ed. And actually what he says is that instead of calling it ing-ed, it's probably better to say ing-able.
Well,
A bull. So like here, let me give you an example. The vast some
bull.
yeah, some
Okay.
vast collection of mental operations actually conceal a distinction that is not clear. Um, if I can do this well, you'll have a huge aha moment
Yeah.
with respect to Descartes and sense certainty and all this kind of stuff. It's actually a pretty cool move that he makes, and he does. Sellers does it really quickly. It made something like 5 or 10 paragraphs or so. Completely demolishes the Cartesian picture. But in any case, I'll try to do my best with it. So let me give you an example. When we talk about belief, it's not one thing. It's at least two things. There's the act of believing, and then there's some content that's believable. Mm-hmm. Or you think, like Frege actually makes this distinction too. There's thought, but thought should really be understood as thinking and some sort of activity, and then the content, which is thinkable. And now here's the thing about that, which makes it obvious. Um, all sorts of thoughts are thinkable without you thinking them, right?
Yeah, sure.
Like for instance, I'm holding a dead chicken under my desk.
Yeah.
That's not something that you had ever thought before, but it's thinkable whether or not you were thinking it, right? In other words, as a content, it's distinct from the activity of say thinking. So all sorts of things are like this: experiencing, believing, thinking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so that's the one really important thing to keep in mind, this distinction that whenever you talk about representation, for instance, there's representing and then that which is representable, the content, right? So the kind of high level distinction that Sellars brings about here is between the epistemic and the non-epistemic, right? And so yes, epistemic is the content, the bowl, and the non-epistemic is the ing. Another way to look at it is justification, which is epistemic, which is to say, this belief justifies that belief, which justifies that belief. It's talking about like the contents of the belief justifying other beliefs, whereas there's the believing, which could be understood in purely causal terms.
Yeah.
Right? In other words, for whatever reason, maybe we don't have a good theory for how the brain produces beliefs, but nonetheless, at least in principle, it's easy to imagine that when I do that, and I ask you, what did I just do with that bottle? All of that stuff can be described in physical terms as, reaching your body in some sense and in some way, and your brain starts firing and so on, and then it leads you to do the following sort of activity, believing something. But that's all causal. Yeah. Right? But that's the ing part of believing. But then I ask you, but what do you believe? And I think when I ask that I'm saying the same thing, right? That like in believing something just means having a belief. But actually they're different things. Because the believing can be accounted for in purely causal terms. But the thing that's believed has to be understood in terms of justification, which isn't causal. Yeah. Right? Is that clear?
Yeah. So it seems like justification falls under like the analytic and believing.
Well, here's the thing. Okay, so like on sense data theory, what's going on is there's this belief that when I see something, I get this mental representation, the sense datum, that is something that's produced causally, right, but then can turn around and justify beliefs. And what Sellars is saying is, no, that's a confusion. Those are two different things. There's the causal thing, And then there is the non-causal justificatory thing, which is saying that because I see this bottle, I know that there's at least one object on my desk or something, right? Now, the big distinction is that what Sellars is going to do is say that it should be kind of confusing, kind of surprising that something that's causal should be able to motivate something that's non-causal, a justification, right? How is it possible that something that's causal, these light waves hit me and my brain fires and it makes me do something where I say, I believe that there's a bottle on my desk. But wait a minute, that was causal, but justification isn't causal. Justification is normative. It's about inference. That wasn't an inference. So the reason that the sense data theorists think that this is a sort of certainty is that that itself is not inferential, but it can be the justification for further inferences. So this is one of these things where it's a regress stopper, right? It's in the chain of inference, but it's a starting point because I got it non-inferentially, but I can make inferences from it. So that's supposed to be how certainty is possible in sense data theory. What Sellars is saying is no. There's this causal thing that's going on, and there's this justificatory thing that's going on, and somehow we have to figure out how these things link up. But what was non-inferential wasn't the belief. What was non-inferential was the causal interaction of this and then my brain starting to fire in such a way that we call it believing, right? But the problem is that that's not enough to get to the justificatory content. How do you get to the justificatory content, right? So that's one way of looking at it. Yeah. So now here's the thing that Sellars does, which I think is really interesting. The next part is to ask, okay, so what is this justification kind of stuff? Right? It's not causal in the immediate sense in the way that the ing is. So the question to ask is not, what does this sentence mean, or is this sentence true? The question is to ask, what are you doing when you make a claim about truth? Is that clear?
What are you doing when you make a claim
Yeah. So think about it. Quite often, what we think about, say, if I say, oh, it's true that 1 = 1 or something like this, to the extent we even think about that as activity at all, which traditionally is kind of questionable whether that's really activity in the sense of the world of change and perception and stuff versus, say, pure thought or something like that. Just the very fact that, say, Platonic forms are timeless. You can't have timeless activity. Activity has to happen in time, right? So therefore, to the extent that we're coming to know that 1 = 1, we're somehow in contact with the non-temporal. That's also related to Kant and the fact that he wants to have time just be a form of intuition and so on, right? So, either it's not activity at all, or if it is activity, it's the activity of coming into contact with the atemporal. Okay, but that really is to say that thought isn't essentially activity. What Sellars is saying is no, it is activity. But what we need to ask is not, is that claim true, but rather, what are you doing when you make a claim? In other words, what social function, what social role does making claims have? Is that clear?
Right, yeah. So
like if I'm a strong foundationalist, I could deny that making a true claim has any social function. Because I could say, well, it might have a social function, but that's not important. What's important is the fact that it's gotten me in touch with mind-independent reality. So yeah, it has we talk about it, but that's not that important. What's important is that non-social, non-historical, non-temporal truth that I have come in contact with. And so I was just saying, no. We can just think about claiming things are true in terms of a certain sort of social activity. right? So that's the next step that's important. Now, if we do that, we'll see that there's no way to base knowledge on completely neutral or non-conceptual observation, in other words, the given, and that all justification, it's not to say all sensation, but all justification is going to be theory laden. Mm-hmm. Which means that it is entirely possible that I'm getting all sorts of sensory bombardments that are not conceptualized. But just because they're not conceptualized, they can't be justifications for anything. Yeah. Right? And it just so happens I never do use those as justifications because I'm probably not even really aware of them. Yeah. Right? Yeah. But it's that specific moment where you take a sensation and somehow convert it to something that is not a sensation, a justification, a belief about something. Yeah. It then becomes conceptual, right? In other words, what you're doing is the way that he describes it is in terms of taking an activity and translating it or bringing it into the space of reasons, which is to say that I can be aware of my activity, but then I can take this other stance towards my activity, the stance of justification, where I say, for instance, I describe my activity in a way that is now conceptual and can be used as a justification for other things. Yeah. Right. And if I take it to be true, it means I'm actually endorsing it. Yeah. Right. I'm saying that not only, is it possible that this happened or that I'm saying that no, it really did happen. I'm endorsing it in the way that a politician endorses an advertisement or something. It's like I give my support to it. There's a commitment. There's a commitment. Yeah, exactly. So it's just like, calling something true is to simply say, well, what I'm doing is describing a state of affairs, although maybe describing is not quite the right word. I am bringing, say, in the case of an observation, I am talking about my activity in a self-aware way, in a way that is mediated by concepts. And just because it's mediated by concepts, I can now use it as a justification. Right. Okay. So let's see. What do I have here? Yeah. Okay. So now the next bit, I enable distinction. So we talked about the ing versus ed distinction, and that the ing, the sensing, is itself causal, but the ed, the content, so the believable or the thinkable or that is justificatory, right? And there's got to be some way that these things link up, which you can look at in this series of arrows. So you've got the world, and then the sensing, which is the causal relationship between us and the thing we're sensing. Somehow, though, in the sensing to belief, there is this interesting sort of translation into the space of reasons. Yeah. And then the belief can act as a justification for further inferences. Yeah. Right. Okay.
So what I'm gathering is like me, let's say I believe that there's a jar on the table. In the causal aspect, there's nothing about believing, like in the right.
Yeah.
So there's like with the light waves hitting my retina or whatever. Yeah, in that cause, there's like nothing about believing that cause, and it's only believing is like after, like, or
yeah, basically, right. I mean, it's yeah, exactly. So and there are a couple things that are important here. One problem with certainty, and the account of certainty, is that it's not just a direct, unity between, say, a sense datum, which is itself a belief. Rather, what it is that, I've got this sensation, and it might even produce the following sort of activity, believing, but the believing itself is also not a justification. Yeah. The believing is just my brain firing in a certain way. But then I can take a sort of normative stance, right? I can choose to describe my activity in a way that uses concepts that can stand in justification to other beliefs.
Yeah.
But once I do that, it's not certain anymore because it's mediated by concepts, it's mediated by theory, it's mediated by a web of beliefs and all this other stuff. And so I lose that immediacy.
Yeah.
Right? Which was supposed to be what makes it certain, the fact that it's not mediated, it's just this thing.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, and so the next part's really interesting now. If you drop down to the looks is distinction. The looks is distinction is just one more example of the ing ed or ingable distinction. And so he tells this story about a guy who owns a tie shop where they sell neckties. And so this is, I don't know, like in the 19th century before they've invented electric lights or whatever. And this guy's name is John. So John is really good, very knowledgeable about the ties. Certainly knows what color they are.
Yeah.
And so whenever a customer comes in and asks for a green tie, he gives them a green tie. And this is right around like 1910, I guess. And so they're starting to install electrical lighting everywhere. And John's the last one to get electric lighting. He doesn't like it. He doesn't like the newfangled ways of progress. Finally, though, he does get the lights installed in his shop. And then someone comes in and asks for a green tie. And I guess these lights are kind of yellow or something. And so what John does is give the guy a tie. And then the guy says, wait, no, that's just a second. Let's take this outside. I don't think that's a green tie. It's like, what are you doing? It's a green tie. So he takes it out. They go outside. In the lighting, the natural lighting, John realizes that it was actually blue. And so then John has to figure out, how did that happen?
Yeah.
Is it possible that ties change color? Is it possible that the electricity somehow zapped the tie and made it green for a little while, but then when the electricity was gone, it turned back to blue or something like that? Or is it that the tie looked green, but that it actually is not green, it's blue? And so the important distinction here is between looks and is. Yeah. And what Sellars is going to want to say is, what are people doing when they use looks versus when they use is? Now, this is not to say that there's some metaphysical status to looking or to being. It's to ask, what is the social thing that people are doing when they use these words, looks versus is? And before the electric lighting, when John says, that's a green tie, how does he know? Well, he's looking at it. Yeah. He's saying, it looks like it's green, and so therefore it is green. Yeah. After the electric lights come about, however, what happens is that John sees the tie is green, or looks green. Yep. But then he remembers, I was wrong in the past. I'm not totally sure. I don't want to tell this customer something that's false and have them be angry at me. So I'll say, it looks green. But in saying it looks green, something really interesting is happening. When I said it looks green, what I'm also meaning is it is green, which is to say that I am describing a state of affairs, and I'm also endorsing it. Yeah. What I'm describing as the state of affairs is how it looks. Yeah. Which is to say that's the ing part of it. And in addition to that, I'm also asserting that it is green. But that asserting, what is that? That's just me saying, I stand behind this belief.
That's the justification.
Yeah, but what is the justification? There's nothing ontological about it. It's that in addition to saying that I am sensing that this is green, right? Or I have the sensation of green. Actually, what Sellars really says is that these are different kinds of sentences. But for now, let's just say, I'm saying that it appears green to me. But in saying it merely appears green, but who knows what color it is, what I'm doing is making a report about the causal relationship of me with respect to the rest of the environment. But then what I'm doing in saying who knows is withholding a commitment. I'm withholding the endorsement. In other words, what I'm doing is saying, I'm giving maybe kind of a report of the causal part of that, the ing, but then I'm saying, I don't endorse whether this is green or not.
Mm.
Now, the idea is that when I do that, when I say it merely looks green, what I'm saying is I have the temptation to call this thing green and to endorse that belief that it is green. But I am withholding that temptation. I'm resisting the temptation to endorse the belief that it's green. Now, here's the thing that's interesting about that. Since in saying it merely looks green, I'm simply withholding the belief about whether it is green. What I'm doing is I'm withholding endorsement of the ed part of that.
Yep.
I'm reporting the ing part of it, but I'm saying even though I have the temptation to then use that as a justification, I'm going to resist that because I've been wrong in the past. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But in doing that, I'm not making any commitment with respect to justification of further inferences. I'm withholding a commitment.
Yep.
And just because I'm withholding a commitment, I'll try to make this clear. Just because I'm withholding the commitment, what I'm doing is simply making a report about something that has no justificatory status, right? You know, just how you said when you fall, that's not a justification. A belief about falling is a justification. But what I'm doing when I say it merely looks green, but I'm withholding the endorsement of that as a justification, it's just like falling without having a belief about falling,
yeah.
right? And so I'm reporting my temptation, but I'm saying I'm resisting the temptation, and so I'm not making any commitment towards the justification of further inferences towards the truth of that. Well, what that means is that for one thing, it's pulling apart the idea that the looking is giving me the justification itself. But the other thing that it's doing is giving an account for why Descartes thinks that sensation is something you can't be wrong about. Is it clear why? It has to do with withholding. I didn't give the clearest the clearest demonstration of it, but
yeah. So I mean, well,
see if you can figure it out, and then I'll tell you what
yeah. Well, so
the answer is.
Descartes is not withholding, right? Because he says, "I think, therefore I am."
Yeah, so let's not worry so much about I think therefore I am, because that's not strictly a statement about sensation.
Right,
but Descartes does hold that sensations, because they're representations, are foundational, right? They give us some kind of certainty, sense certainty, right? Like even if you have a hallucination, you can't be wrong that you're having a hallucination. Yep. And so that's supposed to somehow be something that you can then use as justification for beliefs, right? But what Sellars is saying is the looking part of it is just causal. It's not a justification. And in fact, in saying it just looks this way, but I withhold my endorsement of that as a belief, what I'm simply saying is something like, okay, causality is happening, but there's no justificatory thing. I am resisting doing that. Well, what that means is that the thing that looks like a claim, yeah, like this tie looks green, isn't a claim.
Yeah.
What it is simply an expression or a manifestation of something that's causal.
Yep.
Right? It's not a claim in the sense of something being truth functional. It's simply another, maybe like reverberation of the causality itself, right? It's just an expression of causality. Mm-hmm. But then when I say, but I withhold the endorsement of that, I'm not bringing in the justification. Well, if the looking part of it isn't about justification, if it's not a claim, it's just sort of like a manifestation of causality, then it's not something I can be wrong about.
Yeah.
But not because it gives me certainty. It's not about knowledge at all. It's not about justification at all. It's just causality in a sort of a different expression. But the thing that's interesting about that is that it keeps that aspect where you could see, oh, this is why Descartes thinks that, or the sense datum theorists could think that sensation can be a source of certainty, because they think it's also a belief. But what Sellars is saying, no, that sensation is causal. So you can't be wrong about it, but not because you can be right about it. You can't be right or wrong about it.
It just is.
Yeah, it just is. Yeah, exactly. So That's a really brilliant move, right?
Yeah.
And it comes down to not asking, is it true? What knowledge does it give us? But simply, what am I doing when I say that looks that way?
Yeah.
Versus what am I doing when I say, I believe it is this way? When I say it looks this way, I am manifesting my function as a causal uh, object or something, right?
Yeah.
The fact that I am the sort of causal object that, in addition to being in the chain of cause and effect, can also be made to make sounds that are further reflections or further expressions of that causal relationship. But those sounds aren't justifications,
Yeah.
right? They're just causal.
Yeah.
And so therefore, since they're just causal, I can't be right or wrong. And so that undercuts the idea that I can get certainty out of it, because while I can't be wrong, I also can't be right. And then the other part of it is that the justification is something that I'm doing, which is to say, look, seeing this makes my brain operate in a certain way that fires in a certain pattern that makes me do the following thing, believe something. But then in using that as something that I can use to justify is simply me saying, I approve of that.
Yeah.
Right? I stand behind it, or I take it to be something that I can make further claims about.
Yeah.
But not that there's any specific epistemological or metaphysical status to it. It's simply, I mean, there is an epistemological status to it. It's just that epistemology is a game that we're playing that has certain rules that people accept, you know. So that's the thing. It's fairly subtle, but the main thing is that sensation, if you just think of it as causal, and belief as justification, there's no necessary link between these things. But then also the justification is one way of describing a sort of game.
Yeah.
That's probably enough. Maybe next time I'll talk a little bit about how,
Behaviors.
well, no, how Kant's aesthetic judgment
Oh,
fits in there,
I
which
see.
I think is actually it is compatible with what Sellars is saying,
Yeah.
but also kind of moves in a direction that Sellars doesn't talk about.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. And then we can finish out the rest of it. All right. See you.
Yeah.